Talking after the speakers in the morning is going to be a bit difficult for me for one simple reason. As Clem indicated, I'm one of the economists that he was referring to, that I will not be able to use only one hand. I'm forced to use two hands. And unfortunately, I'm going to be looking backward more than looking forward. Thirdly, I'm going to be sharing ideas or experiences that we've picked up from some of the countries that he has already written down, such as Australia. But I think there's a lot we're still going to learn from those countries, irrespective of what we have heard from him. This is the roadmap that I'm going to follow today. And this is why I emphasize that I'm going to be looking backward and try and see what we thought was going to happen 2 years ago still holds today. I'll start off with a global background. And what we said 2 years ago was that as a global economy, we're at risk of a potential vicious cycle. And this vicious cycle is something that started as a small problem in one corner of the world and extended itself into what is seen as a multifaceted crisis today. Depending on how we respond, that vicious cycle is going to be realized or that vicious cycle is going to be stemmed. And as we continue with the discussion, we're going to see how the vicious cycle is likely to be stemmed. The Economist put it very well at the beginning of the year and said last year it was banks and this year it is countries. In fact, going forward, the biggest challenge is our governments. How are they going to respond to the challenges that are facing us? The broad recap, based on all that has been said this morning, is that the economy is king. It does not matter how well you design your retirement institutions. If they are based on a fluid foundation, an unstable economy, all that will go to naught. Therefore, the state of our economy is very critical going forward. And unfortunately, if we don't develop a firm base for our retirement environment, the likelihood is that retirement funds are going to remain the victim going forward, as we've seen in the past. Fortunately, there's a silver lining. And the silver lining here is what was emphasized by Momo earlier on this morning, that it doesn't matter where you go. Every forum globally is now dealing with the importance of stability and, in particular, macroeconomic stability. And if there is anything to go by, one can conclude that the possibility of another crisis in the near term is very low. What are the macro conditions? We've just emphasized the importance of stability. The macro conditions that we're faced with today is that the economic turnaround is very slow. And given the pace of the turnaround, there's been two speeds in terms of how policy responds, or two approaches is how policy responds to the challenges that we're faced with. One of the responses has been throw money to the problem. The other response has been change the regulatory structure and make sure that people start behaving differently. Now, somebody needs to bring this together and make sure that they converge. But at the bottom of all this, for us to see a sustained turnaround into the future, the economy, job creation, and the generation of incomes is extremely important. What we've seen in the OECD, and in particular amongst European economies, is that a problem that was foreign to them a while back is becoming quite real, the problem of youth unemployment. That is one of the things that they're grappling with today. This is something that we've been trying to grapple with as South Africa for a very long time. So the labor market is critical. If we want to change the situation that we're in, we need to deal with the labor market. And what is critical in the labor market is the flexibility of the sector. Successful economies, successful dispensations have been able to come out with sustainable retirement programs purely on the basis of how well they change their labor markets. Now, unfortunately, labor markets or labor market flexibility is taboo in South Africa. As soon as you say labor market flexibility, there's blood on the floor. But we need to reverse our perception towards that concept. There is no way you can improve productivity in the economy. There is no way you can hope to have a sustained economy over time if the labor market is not flexible. And this is not just about wages. It's about skills. It's about the cost of moving labor units from one point of the country to the next. It's about the ability to migrate labor units from one sector of the economy to the next. The adaptability of labor markets is extremely critical. Making sure that the labor markets respond to business cycles. We haven't seen that in South Africa yet, and this is a challenge that we still have to grapple with going forward. Given the crisis, we've been asking ourselves a number of questions. Is this the worst crisis that we've come across? When another crisis comes up, how are you going to deal with it? It's very difficult to answer the numerous questions that have come up. But the one question that we've been able to answer is that a banking crisis has a deeper negative impact on an economy than a non-banking crisis. The next 3 to 4 slides will try to illustrate that. This slide shows the depth or the impact on growth of the crisis. The left-hand side looks at a bank-originated crisis, and the right-hand side looks at a non-bank originated crisis. You will see that the duration in a bank-originated crisis is about 30 quarters on average, whereas a non-banking crisis is only 12 quarters. And that tells you the impact and the lingering of the impact of a bank versus non-bank originated crisis. This picture tells us exactly the same thing. The collapse in investment is much deeper in a bank-originated crisis than in a non-bank originated crisis. We also see it in the fiscal performance. The debates that have been taking place between Germany and the US at the onslaught of the crisis, in fact, it's not even correct to say Germany and the US. Chancellor Merkel and the US was indicative of this problem. And all that Merkel was saying is, after the crisis, we do not want to end up with a structural problem that we cannot resolve. That would have created ourselves, because the US was saying throw money to the problem, and Merkel was saying no, you may be able to do something else and achieve the same objective. And what you see there is the debt overhang that follows a bank crisis as opposed to a non-bank originated crisis. It's not surprising that the OECD is sitting with such deep deficits today relative to what we were seeing in the past, which is the red bar. And this becomes the biggest challenge for the global economy, which Clem Santa mentioned earlier on. And Finwick put it very well in May and said, the debt overhang is our biggest challenge, feel it, it is here. South Africa never escaped the problem. We experience a collapse in growth. We experience a collapse in household consumption. That means the welfare in the economy on average has come down instead of it having gone up. And at the same time, household debt continued to rise. Capital formation, which is investment in the country, declined. And what we had predicted 2 years ago was that this dip was going to be recorded in the first half of 2010. But look at when it started, which means the biggest challenge for the economy is our investment performance. And as a result of all those observations, we've seen a dip in employment. And if we're concerned about sustainable retirement funding, this is the area which we have to worry ourselves with. How do we make sure that you keep people in the labor market? How do we make sure that we keep people productive? But what are the prospects? The prospects look quite positive. Looking at the OECD picture, which is driven predominantly by China and the US. And why China and the US? It's because of the relative flexibilities of those markets. Labor, the financial sector, and other sectors of those economies. And what we see amongst OECD countries is that where there is low flexibility, the turnaround is much slower. South Africa is also beginning to benefit from that, and we think that this is going to be sustained. Why? Because we're beginning to see the manufacturing sector showing a turnaround. We're even beginning to see that in mining, which has been a part of the economy that has been suffering the most. Much as there's this positiveness, there are challenges, and we need to deal with these challenges head on. The debt overhang is one of them. Poor savings is another. The labor market is critical. What has been the impact on retirement funding amongst OECD countries? When we were looking at the vicious cycle graph, we showed that the first impact of the crisis was the retirement market or asset prices. And this is shown on the left-hand side, which is at the light blue bars of that graph, which is 2008, where we experienced in the OECD countries an average asset collapse anything between 20 and 23%. That has been turned around this year, and the question that people continue to ask is, how sustainable is that turnaround, and are we going to fully recover within the next 2 to 3 years? It's very difficult to answer that question, but what we have seen amongst South African funds is the same picture is beginning to show. But because South Africa did not suffer as much in terms of the collapse, we've seen the turnaround being much steeper than we have seen amongst OECD countries. And what has driven the relative impact on the various countries is the relative exposure to equities. And the countries which are on top are those that are more exposed to equities, and they have suffered slightly more than those which were not exposed to equities. But what we're beginning to find is that this recovery is going to take a long time to recover all the losses that were recorded in 2008. What we find here is that over the past year, we've only recovered 1.5 trillion US dollars of the 3.5 which was lost. Amongst countries which are driven by DB schemes, where they are sitting today is at a funding rate of 75%. And to close that 25% difference is going to be a steep climb for a lot of these countries. And this is how the FT actually represented it. There's a survey that has been done in the past 6 months, which tries to look at how Europeans are responding to the crisis and what we are learning from these responses. What we find is that the optimism is quite low. It is low because the majority of countries are sitting at the 50% mark, and most of them do not believe that they are going to retire comfortably. And that is also explained by what is called the retirement gap. The actual versus what people are expecting. And what you find is that the European average is that what is expected of people to retire comfortably is twice what they are actually going to realize, which means people are going to realize only 50% of their expectations. And that is a huge challenge. The 40% replacement ratio that we're talking about in South Africa is now about that replacement ratio that a lot of European countries are beginning to see as a reality, as opposed to 70, 80% before the crisis. And what are the key concerns, which are very critical even to us? One of the major concerns is health, the cost of health. That means the debates that we're having in South Africa around the NHI versus social security and retirement reform is very critical. If countries such as European economies with very solid social security nets, which include health benefits in there, are concerned about their ability to fund their health bills when they get into retirement, our situation is worse than that. One of the issues that I think is something that we need to think about as well as a country is the fourth bar, which is inflation. We have always assumed that European economies don't concern themselves about inflation. simply because they have what we call a stable inflation environment. Inflation is so low such that they don't even have to think about it when they make their day-to-day decisions. But they're beginning to see it as a major issue. It is fourth on the list. Now, in South Africa, we're faced with inflation rates much higher than those in Europe on a structural basis, ignoring the current picture that we're looking at now. On a structural basis, we're much higher than Europe. Yet, we still have people saying, don't worry about inflation targeting, worry about other things. And this is a lesson that we need to come out with. What have been the responses so far? These are numerous, and they have tried to deal with them from different channels because there is no silver bullet to try and deal with the challenges of the crisis. From the macro point of view, the issue of trust and confidence has been elevated amongst the OECD countries. And this is because a lot of people are walking away from markets arguing that they no longer trust them. There's also the issue of the financial sector itself. How do you make sure that you bring back that trust? You bring back that confidence? And regulation is one of the responses to this problem. The point that was raised earlier on about the decision from the Basel meeting over the weekend is indicative of this problem. And they are saying, we cannot resolve our problems if we continue with a relationship where the users of the financial sector have no confidence in it delivering for them. In terms of dealing with the retirement space specifically, they have acknowledged that there's a very close link between the economy, employment, and sustainable retirement. And for them, growing incomes is extremely important. And they have concluded that we might as well do nothing else but making sure that we get people back into jobs. And I was very glad that Brenda indicated that as one of the key objectives of the state. Savings has been seen as one of the major challenges for the OECD countries, irrespective of the fact that they are recording better savings than South Africa. And in South Africa, it has taken us a long time to realize this link. And as a result, they have come out with a number of schemes to try and force people into some level of voluntary savings at the individual level. But what has also happened is governments that have found that they can no longer meet the DB obligations, they have forced individuals from the DB structures into DC structures to encourage them to see that saving at the individual level is much more important than saving at the group level. In terms of social pressures, it has become very clear that not everybody can continue looking after themselves. They are trying to strengthen their social security nets in order to put a floor below which the welfare can drop. And that becomes one of the things that we need to think about as South Africa, whether or not we can afford, and if we can, whether or not we can sustain it into the next generation. At the individual level, it has become very clear that the concept of a retirement age is becoming quickly irrelevant. And what is important is when you get to a point where you want to retire, you need to ask yourself, am I ready for the retirement? And if you're not ready, you try to live longer and work longer. If you can't do both those things, you die early. One of the biggest risks or biggest challenges that we're beginning to see is the risk of policy reversal. A lot of governments are beginning to say, a lot of the things that we wanted to do are not sustainable. We don't think we can meet those obligations, and they are backtracking on their promises. And this reversal is going to be the biggest challenge. And this is not only on the retirement space, it's in the labor market space, it's in the macroeconomic space, and in certain instances in monetary policy decisions. And that, to me, is one of the biggest risks. However, there's an outlier. We're not all that bad. And I've picked Australia deliberately this year, and unfortunately it coincided with a negative view from Clem. Previously, I've used Sweden, I've used Chile, and people have said, aren't there any other countries out there? And I've used Australia for one specific reason, the emphasis on institutions, which are very important in delivering anything that you want to do. Australia is one of the very few economies that has not experienced a recession. When the rest of the world was liberalizing from the monetary policy side, Australia was tightening because they were having problems in their country. They are one of the leading economies in terms of labor market flexibility. And they did it in style because it involved labor unions in the process. And this is why they are not struggling with a liberal labor market where unions are marching against government policy every single year. Thirdly, their regulatory environment has been tested for a very long time. It's not only now that they are concerned about regulation. They started thinking about regulation many moons ago. They are leading amongst OECD countries. They respect institutions. Once an institution has been set up, it is adhered to. One of the things that they picked up was that we are where we are as the global economy because of bad regulation. They've had to change the role of their Ministry of Finance. Their Ministry of Finance is now not only responsible for the budget, it's also responsible for deregulation. It's now called the Department of Finance and Deregulation. And deregulate to ensure productivity, to protect competitiveness, and to make sure that they manage prices down. And they've been one of the pioneers of the Regulatory Impact Assessment Program, where no policy gets put out without it going through the rigor of an RIA. Today in South Africa, we are concerned about decisions that we've made in the past, and some are being reversed, others are being funded more because they are now costly. The choice between going the defense, buying defense arms as opposed to recapitalizing Eskom in 1999, today, if we're given an opportunity to make the decision again, we would have decided differently. 2 days ago, we've been told that the PBMR, Pebble Modular something, has been put on ice simply because we've concluded it was the wrong decision from the outset. Had we had an RIA then, probably would have made a different decision today. And this is why Australia has been successful, because it has this framework that forces discipline, that forces consistency, that forces decisions across sectors of the economy, instead of a department making a decision independent of what is happening elsewhere in the economy. And how they have responded to the crisis, the previous slides were looking at the past. How they've responded currently is that they've been very particular in how they respond. They only looked at targeted fiscal stimuli. If you're a company that did not deserve to be assisted, they didn't assist you. It wasn't a blanket assistance. Right? And one of the things that they emphasized was a very strong link between monetary policy and fiscal policy. They had to talk to each other. What do we learn from Australia? Long-term planning is important. Decisiveness is important. Strong and predictable institutions, critical. And they've also been able to show that effective communication between the public sector and the private sector is very important. There's a fundamental problem where you have a government sending different signals from different departments which are conflicting. There's nothing wrong in different departments sending a lot of signals, so long as they are consistent and they are talking to each other. It's easy for us as taxpayers to make the right long-term decisions. And what about beyond the crisis? Today, there is no difference between a DB and a DC. We have seen amongst the OECD countries, governments and companies walking away from their DB commitments. What is important now is every individual should be able to ascertain that whatever resources they have aside are going to be adequate when they get to retirement. Being in a DB should not be a comfort zone. That your employer is promising you a particular income at retirement doesn't mean that that income is going to be adequate for you. You need to do your own individual assessment outside of that DB group. And hence government is critical, risk management, education. and jobs. We have to emphasize that repeatedly. And amongst the OECD, they actually, because they've identified the issue of jobs as critical, they've identified a number of interventions which they're already working on. We've tried a similar exercise in South Africa in the NEDLAC environment. We're still yet to see the positive outcomes of those interventions. And this is because some of us never respect decisions that may get made in institutions